in addition to the violence that trans and gender nonconforming people are facing, we know that in the 2021 legislative session, we have the most anti-trans legislative session in the history of this country. There are bills being introduced across many states, either in the name of religious liberty or protecting children or ensuring the integrity of healthcare providers that all have the same consequence to do harm primarily to trans people, but to the entire LGBTQ community. And we know locally that we have anti-trans behavior that's come up on our doorsteps. If anyone is not from the area, I encourage you to go online to look at some of the articles, but we recently are dealing with a situation where a school board member on social media made some anti-trans statements in relationship to confirmation hearings around Dr. Rachel Levine, who has done some incredible work protecting Pennsylvanians from the COVID-19 pandemic. And there has been a public outcry and a back and forth that doesn't necessarily we haven't really done anything to continue to protect students. And we are trying to work with the school board to make sure that the school board reflects not only school board policy, but to make sure that all students feel that they can get an education with dignity and don't have to worry about problematic comments coming from administrators. So this is the universe that we're in right now. It really doesn't even cover most of what LGBTQ folks are dealing with. And it's far from the only issue that we are facing as a country. It's hard to not look at the news and see a new horror that we have to confront with and deal with in order to make this country safe for everyone, regardless of your race, your gender identity, your sexual orientation, immigration status, so on and so forth. So this is the conversation that we're having. And right now, I would like to invite the panelists just to speak, just to introduce themselves and to speak a little bit of how they're coming to this conversation. And then I will ask some sort of further questions after that. So first, I would love to start with Sherita, if you could unmute yourself. And I'm gonna spotlight all the panelists. So if you're on a desktop, you should only see them. If you're on a phone, it should be the first people that you see on your screen. So we'll start with Sherita. Hi, Sherita.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And also thanks to everybody who's out here virtually with us this evening. It's really incredible that everybody cares this much about this important issue to take the time out of their evening. So I just wanted to express my tremendous gratitude. As was said, my name is Sherita Gruberg. I am the Vice President of the LGBTQ Research and Communications Project at the Center for American Progress. CAP is a multi-issue, independent, nonpartisan think tank based out of Washington, D.C. We have about 20 different policy teams that cover a range of issue areas, and the LGBTQ team really represents the rest of the organization in that we consider the ways that policies impact LGBTQ folks in their whole lives. So we do work around non-discrimination protections, but also healthcare and education, immigration, economic security, you name it. My team has experts that work on those issues. For us, though, the Equality Act is really a baseline necessity for the community. The fact that it is 2021 and we don't have comprehensive federal non-discrimination protections that basically just say LGBTQ people are just like everybody else under the law is awful. This has been a fight that we've been working on for the last almost 50 years. And we are the closest that we've ever come. And I wanted to share a little bit about kind of the work that my team does to demonstrate the need and the critical importance of this. And so we fielded a survey with the University of Chicago last summer to get a better sense of what LGBTQ people are going through and what their lives are like. And it was really shocking. You know, we've had some tremendous wins in the courts and in our laws, and yet 1 in 3 respondents had experienced discrimination in the past year. For trans folks, that was 62%. For people of color who are LGBT, that was 43%. And surprisingly, Generation Z folks, so the youngest people in our community, were the most likely to report discrimination at 57%. And what was really shocking also was the tremendous negative impact that discrimination has on the lives and health and well-being of LGBTQ people. Half reported moderate or significant psychological impacts from discrimination, a lot of really negative impacts in health outcomes, and in financial security. We had a lot of folks reporting discrimination in the workplace that forced them out and impacted their ability to provide for themselves and their families. And this is just because of who they are. Also, another thing that was really shocking is most of these experiences of discrimination happen just when people were outside living their lives. 50% happen in public spaces like restaurants or stores or things like that, which is also really concerning. We also found that because discrimination is so widespread and the impacts are so traumatic, LGBTQ people take really significant measures to protect themselves from discrimination. So, we have marriage equality as the law of the land, and yet over half of our respondents said that they were hiding their personal relationships because it wasn't safe for them to be out. And when you talk about people who had experienced discrimination already, that escalated to 73% hit a personal relationship just to avoid discrimination. About 2/3 of the respondents had changed behaviors in significant ways to avoid discrimination, from moving away from family and friends, to changing jobs, to changing schools, LGBT, to changing where they live. LGBT folks take really significant measures to avoid this trauma. And it's got a really terrible impact on all areas of their lives. I also wanted to share just like a couple of stories of how this impacts folks. We worked with a couple in Michigan, Christy and Jamie Contreras, who took their 6-day-old baby to the doctor, and the doctor refused to treat their baby. This was a pediatrician that they had picked out ahead of time before they had the baby. They were really excited to work with this doctor, and the doctor refused to treat the baby because her parents are gay. We also were working with a couple out of Houston who were riding home in a taxi late one night. And, it was a married couple. They just exchanged a brief kiss, and the cab driver kicked them out of the cab on the middle of the highway. And so they had to walk to safety in the middle of the night. And so this is what's happening in our community right now, and is really why we're pushing so hard for these strong federal protections. Discrimination is widespread, but we found that most people want to do the right thing. It's not most people who are discriminating against LGBT folks. It's a very small minority, but that's why we need these protections for when it happens, because the impacts are so detrimental on the community. And I'm sure there's going to be more questions, and happy to answer anything, but just really happy to be here with you all this evening.
Oh, wow, what a what a way to sort of frame what's happening nationally. And I'm sure many people on this call can also share stories that are happening in their community of similar things. But like Sherita said, there are a lot more people that support this than don't. So with that, I want to introduce Chrissy. Chrissy, I would ask you to come off of mute.
Hi.
Hi, Chrissy. So you can just introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about why you're here as well.
Hi, well, my name is Chrissy Gonzalez. My pronouns are she, her. I just want to thank everyone for attending this town hall session and for being invited to speak on this matter. This is something that has affected me very personally throughout my life, particularly during my teenage years as a student in high school, because I was subjected to discrimination while I attended school. And I just wanted to share a little something about my own experiences with this matter and why the Equality Act is so important. From my own personal background, I've experienced illegal discrimination based on my gender identity when I attended high school. And that was along with many of my friends and LGBTQ peers. And it wasn't just at the hands of my peers, my other peers who had subjected it to me, but it was also the administration who was supposed to protect us. and it even escalated to violence in certain instances. It was, you know, some people had it worse than others, but it was a really traumatic experience for a lot of us. We were basically forced to a second-class status, particularly us transgender students who had to use separate facilities. And it was giving us a message that we're not equal, we're not as good as the rest of people by relegating us to these different spaces. And I've just, as the old saying goes, you know, separate isn't equal. This was a civil rights mantra, you know, 50 years ago, 50, 60, 70 years ago, and it still holds true. And unfortunately, we weren't an outlier. You know, I've read studies, according to GLSEN, 75% of transgender students, according to this survey, have felt unsafe during school. And it's especially important considering large numbers of transgender students actually experience family problems at home. So I feel that, that it's especially important for these students to have these protections, because if they can't feel safe at home, the very least, they should be able to feel safe at school, where they feel protected and supported. What ended up happening as a result of this discrimination, to protect myself and my other friends and peers that were going through this similar situation, I filed a complaint with the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. And following my graduation, we actually won. And it was found that the actions of the district were legal discrimination based on Title IX. And if anyone isn't familiar with Title IX is a federal civil rights statute that protects discrimination based on sex. And basically what they did was, in recent years, they've interpreted Title IX sex discrimination prohibition to include sexual orientation and gender identity. And although I wasn't able to personally benefit from that resolution that was given between the district and the Department of Education, you know, I had solace knowing that students that were following me had those protections and could feel protected and safe in their school. But following my ruling and other similar rulings across the country, the Obama administration made a very big step in creating guidance that said that LGBTQ students, and particularly transgender students, are protected under Title IX according to their own internal policy. This changed, though, come 2017, when the Trump administration took over. One of the first actions of the Department of Education under Secretary DeVos was the rescindance of that guidance by the Department of Education. And what ended up happening was that was the policy for pretty much the entire 4 years of the Trump administration. Thankfully, right now, with this new administration under President Joe Biden, we have a change in direction and it's no longer relevant, but it really just kind of underscores the need for the Equality Act. Because it is a policy versus a law, it's a lot easier to get rid of a policy versus a law, because policy can just be done away with internally, but a law, you know, you need the legislative actions to actually change it. So that, I feel, really underscores the need for the Equality Act. And you know, with these protections, I believe that if the Equality Act is put in place, that students that are LGBTQ will fare better than previous generations. And that's all I have to say. I want to thank you for, again, for making me a panelist. I'm really excited to speak on this matter.
Christy, thank you so much for sharing not only your story, but also for providing that education. I remember we were in the same room when we met with Senator Bob Casey a few years ago, and I was like, oh, she's on point. She's amazing. So thank you so much, Christy, for sharing with that. And I think as both Sherita and Chrissy have referenced, what we're dealing with right now is the difference between policy, which can be changed, and laws, which are much more difficult to change and offer more protections. And we're hearing now several different kinds of arguments that are being used to support anti-trans legislation in particular, but also anti-LGBTQ legislation generally. And I'm just saying that to introduce the next series of three folks who really have tremendous expertise to argue against some of the more common arguments that we're hearing right now. So the next panelist I'd love to introduce is Ashland. So if you can unmute, you did that very fast. Let me add you to Spotlight. And if you can just introduce yourself and explain a little bit about where you're coming from on this issue.
All right. Hello, my name is Ashland Johnson. My pronouns are she and her, and I want to echo the other speakers and thanking you all for being here and having us on this program today. I am the president and founder of the Inclusion Playbook. We're a sports impact consultancy that works with sports leagues and teams and social justice organizations to transform their communities in and through sports. We work with organizations like the NCAA, the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, and even the NBA to expand LGBTQ inclusion in sports. I am a policy attorney and a former Division I athlete. So I come to this issue in a place of fully understanding how sports are important in transforming not only individuals, but communities. I played sports for most of my life. And for most of that experience, I was actually closeted, which is the case for a lot of athletes. And we still see this today on every level of sport. So we know that sports has a lot of benefits, such as people have better grades, more self-confidence. They have better mental health outcomes, better physical health outcomes. So we know that sports has a lot of benefits, but what we also know is that LGBTQ youth are playing sports at very, very low rates. When it comes to the national average of participation for youth in sports, it's at 68%. When it comes to LGBTQ youth, it is at 24%. And it decreases significantly when it comes to trans youth. So we see when it comes to trans girls participating, you only have 12% of trans girls participating. When it comes to trans boys, you only have 14%. So what we're seeing is a large part of the population is just missing out on participating in sports. So I've spent a lot of my career on improving those numbers and working especially with leagues and teams to help with situations, either with inclusion in the stands, on the court or on the field, and also in the locker room. We've made a lot of progress over the past few years, but what we've seen, in especially the last 2 years, is an onslaught of anti-trans legislation in the states. To put that in perspective, maybe 4 years ago, there were two pieces of legislation that were anti-trans sports bills. Last year, we were up to 20 bills introduced, with one actually passing into law. And this year, even though legislatures have only been open for about 3 months, we're at, I think the last count was 28 as of yesterday. So we're seeing these bills that are trying to deny young trans athletes and students the opportunities to participate based on their in their affirmed gender. So the bills either range from elementary school, high school, and what we also see is college. But what we're recently seeing is some states, when they're realizing they're going to lose NCAA games, they cut off college and they just keep it from K through 12, which is extremely problematic considering Title IX protections. So this is why we need the Equality Act, because the Equality Act would help settle these issues in a lot of states. Like right now, we only have 15 states plus the District of Columbia that actually have trans inclusive laws for athletes. And most of the other states either are in the gray area or have all of these like hoops that an athlete has to jump through to play on the team. But if we had the Equality Act in place, we would see more consistency across the states. It would help improve participation, not just for trans athletes, but for athletes across the board. So this is why I am here today to talk about sports when it comes to the Equality Act and also what's happening in the States. And why I'm so passionate about it again is because I know the power of sports, not just for individuals, but for communities.
Yep. Ashlyn, thank you so much for that. And we were checking in the other day, and I used to do a LGBTQ volleyball league in the city, and we had a whole conversation about how much you learn about yourself and being around other people with sports, and it's just so ridiculous that people are honestly wasting their time trying to punish kids for who knows what their justifications are. So we'll get a little bit more into this in a second, but I want to introduce our final two panelists. First, if it's not sports, it's something else, and sometimes that something else is religion. So I want to bring on Reverend, and I went to Boston College. I am a former Catholic, so this is something I can't wait to hear from. But please introduce yourself and talk a little bit about where you're coming from in this conversation.
Totally. Well, hello, everyone, and it's so good to be here. Such an honor. My name is Reverend Brandon Robertson. My pronouns are he, him, and I am a queer Christian pastor and theologian, and I've also just started working with the Bradbury Sullivan Community Center in Allentown as a faith organizer to help, in particular, pressure Senator Toomey, who is a devout Catholic, to understand that his faith should compel him to support the Equality Act and LGBT inclusion in general. So I'm here tonight just to speak from the faith perspective, an affirming faith perspective, because religion, as you've likely seen, is being used as one of the primary oppositions to the Equality Act. As a Christian pastor and theologian, I really believe that love our neighbor means defending the dignity and equality of our neighbor. I try to live by the principles of the New Testament, where it says, consider others as better than yourselves, and calls on Christians to give up their privilege for the good of others. So I believe that no one should have to hide their relationships or hide their identity. I think our identities as people are a reflection of God's own creativity, and I want to see our full equality and inclusion in every aspect of society. And as a religious voice, I want to speak primarily to the religious fears around the Equality Act. Many of our opponents are using religion, and specifically the Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, as a way to drive a wedge between potential people who would support the Equality Act, because they believe that this is going to open the door to discrimination against them because of their religious beliefs. But that's not at all what the Equality Act does. Anyone who reads the Equality Act can see that there are clear protections for faith-based organizations and faith-based institutions. And religious freedom is never a good defense for allowing discrimination against anyone, but especially LGBT people. And ultimately, I think all faiths at their core call people to defend the dignity and the equity of all people. And so I'm committed not just as a queer person myself who's faced discrimination because of my sexuality, but also as a religious leader who represents religious institutions, because those institutions and the faith I represent is being weaponized against the LGBT community in a way that is completely contrary to the values of most of our faiths. So I'm really honored to be here tonight and just excited to participate in this conversation.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to go ahead and just ask you to send me that little bit of recording so that I can share with my family, who all are Catholics and maybe need to hear this kind of perspective. So thank you so much for joining our conversation. And lastly, if it's not trans kids in sports, if it's not religion, it's this weird deployment of science. And as we have seen, because science has been a very relevant issue because of the pandemic that we're in, science is incredibly political, and medicine is incredibly political as well. So I want to invite Larissa to unmute yourself and introduce yourself and just speak a little bit about why are you here, about how you're approaching this part of the conversation as well.
Sure, thank you. And thank you again for having us all and for all the participants. My name is Dr. Larissa Kashmir. I'm a pediatric endocrinologist at Lehigh Valley Riley Children's Hospital in Allentown, where the Bradbury Sullivan Center is. So I was happy to hear the shout out to our local LGBTQIA+ center. Coming as a pediatric endocrinologist, we are specializing in kids and in hormones. So we are trained in taking care of children who need any sort of medical help with regard to hormones such as insulin or thyroid or testosterone or estrogen. And so having had experience working with more cis kids initially than trans, we found ourselves in a good position to be able to help trans kids because of that expertise. And so whether it is pausing puberty in a cis child because a 4-year-old girl is having periods, or whether it is pausing puberty in a 10-year-old trans child who is having suicidal ideation, we have a lot of experience, actually decades of experience with that type of medication. And similarly, we have experience with estrogens and testosterone. Again, whether it is a 15-year-old trans boy who never, I'm sorry, a 15-year-old trans, 15-year-old cis boy who went, did not go into puberty because of radiation and chemotherapy for leukemia when he was a toddler, or a trans boy who needs gender affirming hormones. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I have a follow-up question for you. And I just, but first I want to remind folks, I see a lot of people nodding their heads in support of what our panelists are saying, which is great. And I just want to encourage you, if you have any specific questions, just to, so we can mine our wonderful panelists' expertise a little bit more and get into the weeds of some of these issues, please include them in the chat, and I will, I have it right in front of me, so I'll be sure to ask the questions as they come in. And I think and I was explaining to a few of the panelists this past week that we have a very vocal community where we live in the Upper Delaware Valley region in the PA, NY, and NJ sides. And I think what would really be very beneficial for us as a community who are trying to improve the lives of LGBT people where we live is sort of understanding a little bit more about these issues, because we get the science says only men and women, and religion says this, that, and the other. So I'm going to ask the panelists a little bit of a similar question in these regards, but I want to start with you, Larissa. I think there was a photo of Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene putting in front of her office in response to her colleague across the hall affirming trans lives, but she put a sign that says science says man and woman. And that informs a lot of the anti-trans legislation, especially when it comes to kids and hormones. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more. You said that there have been hormone treatments have been having for decades. Could you just talk a little bit more about that so that we can understand what exactly is going on and how actually commonplace these things are? And it's not just some special thing that a certain type of kid is getting.
Absolutely. I'll actually go even a step farther in talking about how wrong it is that science says that there's just men and women, because from pediatric endocrinology, we work with kids who have ambiguous genitalia at birth, and we know that all embryo look exactly the same from a genitalia perspective. Not that most of what we do has to do with genitalia, but even for something as concrete as some of the legislators seem to try to make it, we know that there's not black and white, that there is a lot of gray, and it's there are many potentials for different enzymes and different hormone actions to lead to issues that require medical intervention. And so again, from a hormonal perspective, there are a lot of kids out there in the cis community who either require puberty blockers to prevent an inappropriate puberty from happening, And we've been using these medications since the 70s. And so we know that they're quite safe because those kids who were maybe 4 years old in the 70s have gone on to have kids and potentially even grandkids. And similarly, we've been using, again, estrogens and testosterone for kids who either have delayed puberty or no puberty, or who have a genetic chromosomal issue where they will not have a full and complete puberty. And we know that it's beneficial for, again, both cis kids and trans kids to have an age-appropriate, peer-appropriate puberty. There are some kids who require medical treatment just for the psychosocial complications of being a really late bloomer. And so my silly example is the, high school freshman cis boy who is 4 feet tall, trying to hang out with his friends who are, 5'8" and above, and is getting slammed into lockers or something ridiculous and high school-esque. We can help those kids. We can boost them into puberty and help them through, so that they are not, bearing lifetime scars psychosocially of being that different from their peers. And that's how a lot of what we do in gender affirming medicine is informed, that kids want to be like their peers. And it's actually pretty important for them socially and psychologically to be one of the peers and to be to feel included, both from a physical standpoint and a psychological standpoint. And I'm so excited to have somebody who's an expert in sport here. I can't wait to hear everything you have to say, Ashlyn, because that's just one more aspect where kids can feel included. And that is such an important part of pediatric development, and so beneficial on so many levels, from physical to psychological to community.
That I'm gonna sound like a broken record, but like, wow, everyone's just sharing some like such amazing knowledge. I hope this is being recorded. It is. But someone's asking me in the chat that a lot of the times that people say, especially children taking hormones, it's the phrase child abuse is thrown around. And I know you just said a lot of information about how important these things are. So for kids to have like age appropriate experiences, what else would you say to a parent or someone else that says that this is child abuse?
I think I would turn it right on its head to say it's actually abuse to leave somebody feeling suicidal because their gender identity does not match the body that they've been born into, and it doesn't match the sex that they've been assigned at birth. And these kids have such incredible anxiety and depression as part of their gender dysphoria experience. And if we can do anything to alleviate that, that's the opposite of child abuse. I think child abuse is making kids go through life in an inauthentic way and being miserable. Nobody wants their child to be miserable.
I wish that their behavior matched that. But no, thank you so much for that. And you mentioned Ashlyn a second ago, so I want to bring Ashlyn back into the conversation. Some other sort of preconceived things that people say as far as trans kids in sports. I know when I see this issue mentioned in social media, you only see when like a trans athlete wins the competition, and it's insinuating that they won and it wasn't fair. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what is actually the reality of transgender athletes and what the experiences are, and like what do you think about some of these misconceptions that it's like they're imposters in the locker room, or they're somehow getting an unfair advantage because they want to participate in sports at all?
I guess to the first question about like with trans athletes in sports, and when people talk about things being fair or unfair, they keep bringing up the same like one or two examples of trans girls actually winning. They don't bring up the hundreds or thousands of examples of trans girls losing. Just like every athlete, people win, they lose. But you keep hearing those same few examples because it supports a point that they're trying to make about fairness. But when it comes to fairness in sports, the way that people in the sports world think about it is different than, let's say, maybe parents think about it or people don't participate in sports. When it comes to fairness, it's about the rules being applied the same to everyone. That's a level playing field. What they're talking about are notions of competitive advantage. But we all know that when you get to any sports, everybody has some type of competitive advantage. Like I was 6'1" at the age of 12. So there were a lot of parents who didn't like that I was playing against their daughters too, because I had that competitive advantage. There are economic advantages that a lot of athletes have when it comes to playing sports. You see those a lot in the winter sports where they cost a lot of money to compete and be very successful. But these are competitive advantages that people talk about. They're geographic advantages that people have too. So there are a lot of competitive advantages when it comes to sports, but we only seem to care about them at this point when it comes to someone's gender identity. So ways that you can address those questions or those comments are, the science out there does not show that there's a definitive competitive advantage. In the absence of that, we have to think about what are the actual reasons for kids playing sports. And it's not about winning. It's about participation. It's about learning values. That's why it is a right for all students to participate in sports. So we have to bring it back to that. When people talk about the harm of cisgender youth, what we know from the Center for Americans' Progress report is that trans-inclusive policies do not harm cisgender youth. We know that they do harm transgender youth, though, when transgender youth are not allowed to participate in sports. And what we've also seen is that in locations where they have these trans bans actually on the books, participation for all girls goes down. And for all LGBTQ youth goes down. So a lot of the ways that we can challenge these notions are, what do you mean by fairness? And what do you mean by harm? And a lot of times what they're actually talking about is winning. And winning is not the purpose for these sports for kids.
Yeah, that's I think really helpful and really refreshing to hear that so much of the messaging around some of the problems aren't actually coming from the youth themselves, they're coming from other people. So I mean, in your experience, who are the biggest people that are raising this issue that doesn't seem to really exist among the youth? Like who are the people that are really the problems here?
It's usually parents and people who aren't participating in sports. Like the thing about homophobia and transphobia in sports is that the research shows that most of it comes or exists in the stands. It's not on the playing field. So it's not the athletes who are just there to perform at the top of their abilities. It's the people who are around the sports space who feel a sense of ownership of a space that they aren't necessarily a part of and don't necessarily understand. So a lot of times it's people who don't understand the sports space and don't understand the power of sports or the benefits of sports or the purpose of sports.
Yeah, parents, gotta love parents and gotta love people in the audience. So I want to turn it over to Reverend, and this is someone asked this question in the chat. I think we're all very familiar with people using religion to justify anti-LGBTQ behavior, and someone specifically asked if have parents come to you lamenting about their kids' LGBTQ identity, and what are the kinds of conversations do you have with them, and do you find that they've been receptive to what you've had to say to them?
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. I just came out of serving in a church in San Diego for 5 years, and I had so many of these conversations. And the truth is that a lot of the parents and other folks who are distressed by LGBT identities are that way, not because they're bigots necessarily, but because they've never had experience with LGBT folks, and they've never had the opportunity to actually see beyond the cultural stereotypes or the religious stereotypes. And so I often try not to get to debating theology, though there is, from my perspective as a Christian, a really clear case for LGBT inclusion from the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Instead, I'm really trying to help parents listen and learn, not just from their children, but from other LGBT folks. Because what I've learned over the course of my career is that it's empathic understanding that changes people's hearts and minds. And I think that's why also in this conversation about the Equality Act, it's so important to keep lifting up the stories and the real experiences of LGBT folks in various arenas, whether it's in sports or in LGBT affirming faith communities, or all the other stories that we've already heard alluded to where LGBT people are experiencing discrimination as we're simply trying to be. When people actually hear the incarnated reality, that actually is what starts shifting their perspective. And so I think at the grassroots level, when I'm talking to parents or anyone else, it's really a call to uplift and elevate the stories. I always say I'm not actually a fan of being a voice for the voiceless, but rather giving the voiceless back the voice, allowing LGBT people to actually tell our stories, share our perspectives. And when people stop and listen, when people stop and get to know us, that is when they begin to see the truth of who we are as fully equal members of the human family. And that's when their hearts and their minds begin to change. So that's my experience, at least.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. I feel like in my experience of, I went to Catholic school my entire life up and through college, and something that I heard a lot was the Bible says homosexuality, this, that, and the other, and they talk about Leviticus, they talk about Romans 1, and they reference a few other things. And I have it was sort of the blessing and the curse to know a lot about the history of the Bible and like how language gets interpreted over time and those kinds of things. But what do you say to people who say, what the Bible says?
I mean, we could have a theology lecture for an hour if we want to get into it, but I will say, I mean, just some basic things. One, for anyone who's interested in this conversation, there's a new documentary coming out within the next month called 1946, and it's about how the word homosexuality didn't appear in any Bible until 1946. And the documentary goes behind the scenes to show that it was actually deliberately placed there, a mistranslation of a Greek word, deliberately placed there as a way to drive a wedge between the LGBT rights movement and the faith community. And so I just think, like you said, part of this is being willing to learn from the history and the culture and the context of our ancient texts. But then also, again, all of our faith traditions really at their core call us to the simple values of things like the golden rule. Jesus said, all of the Bible is summed up in this: love God and love your neighbor. If that's what Jesus says from a Christian perspective is the whole of what it means to be a follower of Christ, then we should be focusing on that and not on excluding and marginalizing and oppressing folks.
Are you sure you're a reverend? I'm just kidding. I'm just like, wow, this is wild to hear, like someone like you say these kinds of things. That's amazing. Please go ahead and put the link to your church. I will be at your Sunday service. Zoom probably. Pandemic. But I see a lot of folks asking about what needs to be done and questions about the Equality Act, and we'll get to that in a second. We're going to just problem for a little bit more before we talk about the solutions. And Chrissy, I want to ask you to come back to the conversation. You know, in your experience of actually trying to get this done for yourself and for your peers, what did you find to be the biggest obstacle, not only to be just being heard about the issues that were impacting you, but who was the biggest obstacle that stopped the solution from actually happening? And you are on mute.
So the biggest obstacle for me, I believe, was the administration. It wasn't all administration members. I can thankfully say that there were a few members of the administration that were on my side, but it seems like a lot of members did kind of put a thorn in my side when it came to actually addressing these issues for myself and my peers. And it took a long fight to really get things done.
And what did you find really helped you in that fight? Like, what were some of the things that really helped people, or sometimes forced them to really listen to you and understand where you were coming from?
What really helped me was having productive conversations with the members of the administration and teachers and other students that would listen to me and listen to my friends and peers on this issue. I believe that having these conversations is important, and being able to talk diplomatically about these issues is very important. And even, not getting riled up, not getting upset, trying to have these conversations in a healthy and productive manner. I believe that's the most important thing out there with solving these issues.
That's great. I mean, we've been hearing several times now the importance of storytelling, and that is just to reiterate how important it is to listen to people and listen to what their experiences are. But Sherita, I want to bring you into this next question. There are other, you mentioned in the opening that support for LGBTQ protections is actually pretty good and pretty high. So who are the people that are trying to stop these kinds of things, or who are the people that are helping introduce these pieces of legislation, and how are they doing that?
Sure, and you're right. Public Religion Research Institute just came out with a study today on just overwhelming public support for non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people. It's been going up basically every year since they've done this, and I think we're at around 75%. And this is true across religious views. I think the least support we have is from white evangelical Christians, and that's over half. It's from every religious denomination, every single congressional district in the country, every political party, every persuasion, every racial demographic. These are not controversial things. As Americans, we understand that fairness and opportunity are values that we hold dear, and it is against our sense of fairness to have a group that can be discriminated against just because of who they are. Even things that seem so controversial, if you look at the news coverage, like transition-related care, we have nearly 80% of Republicans who feel that doctors shouldn't be allowed to deny care related to somebody being trans. So as a country, we are in agreement here. The problem is a very, very vocal and well-resourced minority. And so if you look at the coverage of who the groups are that are opposing the Equality Act, that are behind this flood of anti-trans state legislation, it's all the same folks that lost the marriage equality fight. They regrouped, they did some message testing, and they found out that folks are not as familiar with trans kids, and that this is an area where they could drive a wedge. Also, these claims around religious liberty surface again. And as we've heard from the other panelists, it's not the reality that you have people of faith over here and LGBTQ folks over here. Like, I'm a queer Muslim. I've got my Quranic verse right behind me. We work with a coalition called Faith for Equality, where we have over 100 faith denominations that have come out in support of the Equality Act, including Catholic organizations. And we just dropped off to the Senate around the hearing about 20,000 signatures from faith leaders in support of the Equality Act. So, there's faith voices with us, there's faith voices against us. There's a bunch of, there's folks on each side, but the idea that it's LGBTQ rights or faith is ridiculous. Also, I wanted to flag the Equality Act protects people of faith. It preserves all of the existing religious exemptions in the Civil Rights Act and our civil rights laws. The Constitution isn't going anywhere. The First Amendment still protections are still strong. And also its updates to public accommodations protections for people of religion make sure that we can't have these stores with no Muslims allowed signs or discrimination against someone for wearing a yarmulke or a cross. That those protections don't exist federally right now. And so it's not just, it's preserving all existing protections for people of faith and expanding it. Again, though, the groups that tried so hard to fight marriage equality lost. They see this as the latest battle that they can undermine protections for LGBTQ Americans and have flooded resources into opposing the Equality Act through the guise of caring about women's sports. Right now we're in the middle of the NCAA tournament. I am a huge women's sports fan, and have been following the coverage of the disparity in treatment between the women's basketball teams and the men's basketball teams. And I just keep thinking, like, if a fraction of the resources that have gone to attacking trans kids playing sports went to actually supporting women athletes and equity in athletics, we would be in a much different situation right now. And it's incredibly frustrating to see how well-resourced they are for opposing the rights of trans girls to play sports, and not actually supporting sports equity for women, which they purport to care about.
You know, it's as soon as you start like asking questions about people's statements, you realize that their statements just like dissolve into air because they're actually just saying something for the moment, but it's not backed by any kind of consistency. But that's a discussion for another time maybe. But I wanted to someone asked a question about the Equality Act. Is there anything else, because you just mentioned a little bit more about what the Equality Act does? Is there anything else that you think we need to know about what's in the bill, just so that we can talk about a little bit more in greater detail about what the bill does and what it doesn't?
Yes, so I'm actually dropping an explainer that we wrote up in the chat. That's a very simple, accessible way to understand what it does and what it does not do. But it, as you said, it expands these protections for LGBTQ folks in areas of life where we critically need it. Chrissy did a great job explaining the ways that protections in education can and should be extended to LGBT folks, but we don't have that in every statute. Like, for example, public accommodations, where I said half of experience of discrimination happened just like going to the store in a cab. There's not sex protections there right now. So you can't interpret existing law to protect LGBT folks. That's another added benefit of the Equality Act. Women can't be charged different prices for the same services as men under the Equality Act. I had a friend complaining about her child getting charged twice as much for the same haircut as a boy just because she's a girl. Equality Act would also address gender discrimination in retail and other marketplaces, as well as race discrimination in retail. Sephora did a study recently and found over half of Black shoppers had experienced discrimination in stores. This would update our civil rights laws to ensure that that is protected under federal law, which is absurd that it's not right now. But it would update those. It would also address discrimination in healthcare, in housing services, in federally funded services. These are really basic things. There shouldn't be any reason why someone is denied access to a critical service that they or their family needs simply because of their sexual orientation and gender identity, but that is happening. We're in the middle of an economic crisis, in the middle of a pandemic. I think it's really clear how awful it is to deny somebody the critical services, be it healthcare, be it food services, that they need. But without this law, that in 29 states, there aren't those protections. I also want to flag that this is nothing new. We have 300 cities with these protections already on the books. We have 20 plus states that are doing this. My original home state of Wisconsin has had sexual orientation protection since 1993. We still have girls' sports. We still have religious institutions, and they are still doing social services. Like, this is not the end of the world in any of these places. All that's happened is when LGBTQ people face discrimination, they have a way to address that. Like, that's the only change. And so that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about some new thing that's not been tried out or tested. This is something that we have across the country, and we're just trying to make sure that your rights don't depend on your zip code anymore.
That's, to your point, in Pennsylvania, there's no statewide discrimination policy that protects people according to sexual orientation or gender identity. So just for the people in Pennsylvania on the call, this is something that would help us directly. So thank you so much for sharing just all of that information. And for folks who may have missed this, in the chat, Sherita included a link that explains a little bit more about what's in the bill and what's not. And there's lots of other links as well. So I think what we can do when Zoom records, we record the transcript so we can share all of the resources that our panelists are sharing so that folks can read a little bit more about this after we're done with the panel. So enough about talking about the problem, even though that's the only thing I want to talk about. Let's talk about sort of the solutions and how we get there. And Sherita, I'll start with you. just because you mentioned that this is the people who are really funding the anti-trans message are the same people who were in opposition to marriage equality. And during marriage equality, we saw a lot of corporations come out in support of marriage equality and really like either signing onto amicus briefs or they're finding lots of ways to show their support. Are you finding that that's happening now? And if it is, how do we grow it? And if it's not, how do we engage some of our corporate folks who really supported the marriage equality stuff to support these non-discrimination laws?
That's a great question. We have about 400 major corporations in the Business Coalition for the Equality Act. Apple has come out really strongly in favor of these protections, along with a lot of other Fortune 500 companies. And so the support is definitely there. I think we can all try to, as consumers, push for more vocal support and more engagement. But they've definitely come out in support. Also, small businesses, Small Business Majority has also supported this. The Chamber of Commerce supports it. The National Manufacturers Association, which is a pretty conservative group, is also come out in support of it. So the business community gets it. They understand that they want their workers to be protected no matter where they live, and that as businesses, this makes sense for them. So that's one area where we have a tremendous amount of support. And also a number of tech companies, I think today came out with a joint statement opposing these attacks on trans kids at the state level. So, you know, there's always more engagement, and if folks have those connections and relationships, encouraging more vocal support, but the business community is definitely there.
That's great to hear. So jumping from the business community, Larissa, I wanna bring you back in. You know, I think I just saw Arkansas pass the law yesterday, or maybe it hasn't been signed yet, but the state legislature passed a law in Arkansas to allow medical professionals to deny care to LGBTQ people. I know you shared a little bit about what you're doing. What are you doing to sort of help the medical community come on board with not only learning about the needs of LGBTQ folks, but what are some of the things that we can do to make sure that our medical professionals, whether they're doctors, nurses, sort of the wide range of people, what can we do to get them to support and understand that this is a part of what they need to think about when they're caring for people?
I think it's all about communication, and I think most doctors are really there to help, and they really like learning, or else they wouldn't have gone to school for so long. And so if you can educate your provider about how we can help you best, that is I would hope always welcome. From our standpoint, we're always teaching the next generation of students, residents, fellows, as folks come up, and even folks who have been out of training for decades have opportunities for continuing education, whether it's through online learning or through conferences like Philly Trans Wellness or the Harrisburg Keystone Conference are two of the ones that folks down in our area try to get to whenever they're happening in non-COVID years. And spreading that information even amongst other folks, because just as part of being a practitioner is the imperative to continue learning, and most folks get to kind of choose what they want to learn about. And for a lot of folks who have been out of school for a long time, that's an area that's lacking. And so if you have a decent relationship with a doctor, a nurse practitioner, and physician's assistant, and say, hey, I know there's a track for medical professionals at this conference. It's a fun time, and you might learn a lot. I really appreciate that sort of information from my patients.
That's great. And two folks asked, I mean, they're not really related questions, but I just want to shoot them to you. One, what exactly is, like, if parents oppose kids receiving hormones, are there avenues for those kids to get them? And the sort of second question that's kind of related, Are you seeing any change in terms of, like, is there an increase in young people getting hormones, or like sort of what does that look like now, and has that changed over time?
Yeah, so the first question is trickier. For the younger kids who need the puberty blockers and might not quite be ready for hormones, that's really difficult to get as an 8 or 10 or 12-year-old without having a parent help you navigate the medical system. They're expensive medications that thankfully are now covered by the vast majority of insurances, and hopefully that will remain the case. But the puberty blockers are really tough. Although when we're able to get them on board, it helps these kids so much to be able to pass and lead their most authentic life without having to deal with some of the discrimination that others have had to deal with. In terms of gender affirming hormones like testosterone and estrogen, there is an age of ascent where kids can get the hormone medication even if parents are opposed, and most of the time we're willing to go with 16. There's a lot of debate amongst medical professionals where a 14-year-old can assent to their own psychiatric care, and so whether that age should be decreased. I think I see probably a biased population, and the vast majority of the kids who come to me have at least one parent who is supportive. And we certainly don't require both parents to be supportive, because that's not always the case. But it is definitely a gray area. But to the extent where, or to answer the question, are we seeing more kids? Absolutely. And I think I'll often share with parents who are saying, is this just a fad? Like, this wasn't a thing when I was a kid. Why is it? I think they're just kind of following their peers, and they want to be cool, and so they want to be trans. And my gut feeling is that with opportunities to share, like people decades ago did not have, I think people are able to express themselves more and to find a network or a community of support online, where folks 30 years ago didn't have that support. And so I think that kept them feeling alone for a lot longer. I'm not sure what the evidence is behind that, but as I speak to more adults at different conferences, and they say, oh, wow, I wish we would have known that there were pediatric endocrinologists who did this back when I was in high school, sort of thing. The other thing that has really improved access is the Affordable Care Act kind of trickled down to Pennsylvania in mid-July 2016. And so prior to, I think it was like July the 18th, almost nothing was covered from an insurance standpoint. And after July 2016, a lot is covered. We might not get the specific brand of hormone covered, or there may be deductibles and copays and that sort of thing. But that has increased aspect, especially for kids who have state insurance, because that's where these rules are starting with. So whereas testosterone was almost always paid for out of pocket prior to mid-2016, now the vast majority of kids have it covered. Puberty blockers are really expensive, and so there were a lot of folks who just went without prior to 2016, and now we can get covered, and usually their choice as to whether they want an implant or injectable. So we've come a long way in that regard.
Thank you for all that great detail, and Obamacare, the gift that keeps on giving. So a few people are posting about religion in the chat, and Reverend, I want to bring you back into this. And someone asked pretty directly that, do you feel like you're an outlier or you're on an extreme in terms of the way that you think about these things compared to other folks who have the power of the pulpit? I mean, we know how important faith leaders are. Do you find that you have colleagues that really share this, your beliefs, or do you still feel like you're on the edges of the religious universe?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the thing is, the unfortunate reality is white evangelicals have learned over the past 20 years how to dominate the media. And so people perceive them as the voice of Christianity or the voice of religion. And the truth is, I'll give a shout out to Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons over there at Center for American Progress, who just wrote a book about the progressive Christian movement and how large it actually is. And in the LGBT affirming space, there are networks of LGBT inclusive Christians and churches. The largest gay Christian conference that happens every year is called the Q Christian Network Conference. And every year there's about 5,000 or 6,000 LGBT Christians that gather in various cities across the country. And they just represent a microcosm of what's happening in churches broadly. And outside of Christianity, these conversations are happening as well. One of my good friends here in Washington, D.C. is Imam Dai Abdullah, who is the first gay imam in the United States. And there are now quite a few LGBT imams around the world. In Judaism, I think of folks like Rabbi Steve Greenberg, who started a group called Eshel that is doing this work among the Jewish community. And so I just really think important to know that the shift is happening. As we heard, almost all religious people across the country are leaning more and more towards the full acceptance and celebration of LGBT folks. And we just need to figure out ways to not allow the white evangelical or the conservative white Catholic voice to dominate the airwaves and make people believe that all religion is anti-LGBT, because the truth is quite the opposite.
Yeah, it's so helpful to hear you say that, because I remember during my time at Boston College, it was ranked the #1 most homophobic school in the country by the Princeton Review my freshman year. And just a little, like, it's a Jesuit Catholic school for folks who don't know. And Boston College's campus has the most Jesuit priests anywhere in the world one time. And we found that in private conversations, a lot of the clergy supported what we were saying on campus, but they would never say anything publicly for fear of retaliation. Is that, I mean, all the denominations are organized very differently, but do you think that, like, so what do we do about sort of the, what do we do about these Catholics and evangelicals? Yeah. I hope you know what I mean. I'm not, if anyone's Catholic or evangelical here, bless your heart.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I come from the white evangelical world. I was raised to be the next mega church pastor of my church that I grew up in Maryland. And coming out, obviously, got pushed out of that world quickly. But again, there's work being done. Father Jim Martin is a Jesuit priest. He's a dear friend of mine, and he's a very vocal LGBT inclusive priest. And he's got the ear of Pope Francis. He serves as an advisor to the Vatican and has met with Pope Francis to advocate for LGBT folks. And New Ways Ministry within the Roman Catholic Church is doing some great work. Among evangelicals, there are folks like my friend Matthew Vines, who has the Reformation Project, which is specifically going into evangelical churches and teaching them biblically why LGBT people should be affirmed. And so I just think, again, most people, unless you're actually digging in and researching these things, you're not going to know that this work is happening, but it's happening. And I really do believe that even if we don't change the Southern Baptist Convention or the Roman Catholic Church in the next 10 years, a majority of religious folks in the United States are going to be LGBT inclusive in the next decade.
Well, listen, you're literally your mouth to God's ears. Like, that sounds great to me. And Ashland mentioned that she has to jump off. So in the chat, she included her email. So if anyone has any questions about any of the work that she does, she's doing some really incredible work to help LGBTQ folks who just want to play sports. Really do some incredible advocacy work. So thank you, Ashland, for being a part of this. She'll see the recording, so she'll see that I said that. So I want to, Chrissy, I want to bring you back to the conversation, because I think that, it's difficult to really put yourself in a position to have conversations with people who don't think that what you're saying matters, or if they don't think that what you're saying is important. And there's many, you know, in the echo chamber of social media, a lot of people have very angry things to say that aren't necessarily very helpful in actually having conversations and doing some of the work. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit from your experience about when you were having these conversations with people, what did you find was really helpful for people to sort of come around to what you were trying to say, and what kinds of things did you either stay away from saying, or did you find didn't really advance the conversation in ways that you'd hope? So I think this is more just like a strategy question. Like, what are good things to say for people to learn, and what are some of the things that people say that are like, no, thank you?
So I'm very a little bit of an analytical kind of person. What I found helpful, particularly with my own experience studying social work right now, is I try to frame transgender issues in the conversation of mental health and how supporting transgender people will, according to studies, and also LGBTQ people in general, will lead to better outcomes in a person's mental health and overall well-being. I found that that is very helpful, you know, providing them with that scientific evidence that, you know, this is something that is ingrained into you, you can't change, and accepting it and embracing it is something that will ultimately lead to a better outcome for your child or your student or your friend or family member.
You know, that's really helpful. And did you find, you know, I think I used to do some LGBTQ advocacy in New York City and Albany, and I found that being sort of in a rural environment here in Pike County, it's very different. So do you just have any advice for whether it's something similar or not, like how do we talk to folks who may not see sort of up close in person, like the diversity of people like in a major city, or there aren't like tons of gay bars in Milford or anywhere sort of in any kind of radius. How do we, what are some just tips for how do we talk to our actual neighbors here who just aren't close to either very diverse places or LGBT institutions?
So I would probably connect them with resources so they can virtually interact with people, such as that. You know, there's plenty of good documentaries out there. There's lots of, thankfully, trans representation in TV shows and movies that's improving. And I believe that getting exposed to that kind of representation when you don't have people around you specifically like that can really help create a good conversation and starting off point for, you know, these kinds of conversations.
That's really helpful advice. Thank you. So just a note to the audience, I believe that I've tried to get a lot of the questions that have been in the chat to the panelists. If anyone has any additional questions, please, again, utilize the chat feature so that we can continue this really amazing conversation. And also if the panelists have any questions for other panelists, I know everyone has a lot to say. So I just want to, just make sure that people get whatever is on their mind out there, because the panelists have been just awesome so far. But in lieu of that, Sherita, I want to go back to you for something that we talked about a little bit. So just to help understand sort of the beast of what we're dealing with, you shared with me a little bit about what strategists thought that the Trump campaign could have done to ensure their win, which didn't happen. But what did you tell me? Just say what you said to me, because this blew me away.
Yeah, so I mentioned the folks that opposed marriage equality have kind of rebranded and attack trans people now, but it's not just them. there are Republican strategist firms who are floating that attacking trans people could win, like, you know, restarting the culture wars to help Republican candidates win. There was a story in Politico about this one firm that was really strongly advising the Trump campaign to go transphobic in the last election, that they didn't. But you saw at the CPAC convention, Trump was suddenly talking about trans people. And it was clear that he wasn't really practiced in the rhetoric, but was definitely just testing it out to see how it worked. In the Kentucky governor's race also, there were some really, really transphobic ads that were put out against Bashar, who ended up winning. And so we're seeing that these attacks don't work. But we're definitely seeing some kind of testing, or the starting of seeing, like, is this going to gain traction? And it really goes to, you know, these aren't real issues. Trans people aren't in any way a problem or a threat to our society. This is a group that needs protections and support, but we were definitely seeing some folks trying to use trans folks as a political football and to score some political points as they're trying just about everything else under the sun to win these elections, which, you know, as the other panelists have mentioned, given the huge toll that this takes on people's lives and well-being, is just really crass and awful to see the politicization of, like, literally people's lives and well-being.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's hopefully apparent to everyone here, judging by how this year has gone so far, that this very well may be the news that we hear leading up to the midterm elections in particular, but this like, trans people might be the focus of 2024. And I think, like, we have a wealth of information that's been shared by all the panelists here, and we have to be so vigilant and very strategic about how we talk to our neighbors. I mean, we in Pike County, it was the bluest we've ever been, but it's still red. And I think if we make a more concerted effort to talking to our folks about, like, relax, like, the information that we're being fed is incorrect and very harmful and dangerous to real people, I think we can be better off, so we can continue to build upon a lot of the progress and a lot of the good changes that I think a lot of our panelists have mentioned. You know, we're surrounded by news that's justifiably very tragic and very negative. It's just not the complete picture. It's a very important piece of how our world is being shaped right now, but there is such good work that's being that's being done right now, and we just have to be smarter about how we build upon that, so that we don't end up in I don't have to say it, we don't end up in the stuff that we really fought hard to get out of in this past election. Someone is asking, oh, so I think I'll open this up to all the panelists. I think gender pronouns are something that have really become a phrase that more and more people are hearing about. And if folks can just say why this is important, and why is it important to talk about our pronouns? What does it do for people to mention what our pronouns are? If any of the panelists would like to say something about that.
So I guess I'll start. So basically, with the usage of pronouns, it conveys a sense of basic respect, I think. And someone actually mentioned in school, you know, I of course, I did have teachers that would use the wrong name and use the wrong pronouns. And it kind of really affected me in a lot of different ways, in a negative way. And I believe that that using it in school, if not at home, you know, when it comes to the right name and pronouns, you know, that's something very important that could signal to a child that's in that situation that I'm here, I'm going to help you, I'm going to respect you, and I affirm you.
That is a perfect summary of why this is important. Thank you. So I think I just noticed the time. I think if all the panelists would like to maybe leave us with something, just either emphasizing something that you or someone else has already said, but just something to leave the audience with about what we need to do or how we need to think about what is ahead of us in this current political, oh my God, my cat is climbing on my lap. I will, Larissa, I'll just pick on you while I put my cat over here. What is just like a closing statement for something that we should think about and really take away from this important conversation?
I think probably my biggest point would be that the vast majority of trans kids, just like all kids everywhere, just want to blend in and do their job at school, which is both learning and playing, and that playing is so important. It's a job of childhood, and to try to take that away, especially in the form of sports, but really in anything, we need more kids playing sports, not fewer. What I do in the office hours of my day where I'm not working with trans kids is very often working with kids who have gained too much weight in the pandemic, and it's negatively affecting their blood sugar and their cholesterol. So there are so many benefits to being active that we want to encourage all kids to be as active as possible, and certainly allow trans kids to be part of the fun. They're not out there to dominate. They're out there to have a great time and to learn through sports, just like all kids can.
I feel like all of these like closing statements are going to be perfect snippets just to like put on repeat in case we need to remember what we're doing this for. Thank you so much for that, Larissa. Reverend, I will call upon you next. What is something you want to leave us with as sort of a closing statement about this conversation?
Yeah, I just think, I mean, from the questions that we've heard, I just want to affirm that things are shifting. We have a lot of work to do, obviously, but especially in the religious world, I know it can seem so disheartening, and it is disheartening, as I watched the hearing last week and saw people continually bring up not only religious beliefs, but desiring to protect and preserve religious privilege as an excuse for opposing the Equality Act. That's only a growing minority voice. Less and less people are aligning with that kind of spirituality, that kind of religion, and more people are embracing an inclusive message. And I think if you just want to be encouraged, faithforequality.org is a list of faith organizations and people of faith that are supporting the Equality Act. And it's a great starting point just to see that there is a growing faith voice that is standing for LGBT rights and inclusion. And I would love to invite all of you into that space, whether you're a person of faith or no faith. All voices coming together around this issue are so vital. So thank you for allowing me to be here.
Oh my God, thank you. Like, listen, all of the years of like nonsense that came onto here because of homophobic Catholic tradition. Some of it's been undone tonight, so thank you. Sherita, I will ask you next. What is something that, as a closing, something that you want to leave with us for something to think about? Just one thing, I'm kidding.
Sure. Well, once again, thank you so much for having me. This has been an amazing panel, and I've learned so much from my co-panelists, and I'm just a huge fan and wish everybody could hear just all of the great information they shared tonight. And I do want to share, like, every single person who has participated tonight can be a huge advocate for changing the laws and for helping us. Like, if Senator Toomey hears from every one of you, that is going to make such a huge difference. And I wanted to drop in the chat, our partners at the NEAT have started equalitytime.org, which is a really easy way to sign up to phone bank in support of the Equality Act. We are getting beaten by opponents who are very well organized and well financed. I think that there's like 4 calls to 1, 4 calls opposing the Equality Act. Again, that is not in line with public opinion and support, but we definitely need our supporters to be out there and vocal and letting your elected officials know how important this is. And so hopefully, you know, everyone tonight has given just so much information. You all are now experts. please, please, please take that and help support changing the law so that everybody is treated equally and our rights are upheld.
Wow, thank you so much for that. And the Reverend included the link faithforequality.org, and Sherita also included equalitytime.org. Please give them a visit. We phone banked the hell out of that last election, and look what happened. If we phone bank the hell out of this, maybe we can change some hearts and minds in the Senate and get the Equality Act passed. Chrissy, you are going to be our final closer of the evening. So what is something that you would like our audience to know as a takeaway from this conversation?
Well, I just wanted to thank again everyone for attending and listening to all of us, and I wanted to thank the other panelists for their amazing expertise. I just wanted to jump off of what Sherita was saying. You know, transgender students often don't have a voice, particularly if they're younger and if they're in K-12 education. So it's very important that we can be their voice. So contact your senators, contact your elected officials on this. This is a very important issue for all of us. And I believe that, you know, we can make this happen. We have the numbers on our side and we can do this.
Yeah, we can do this is right. Thank you, Chrissy. Thank you, Sherita, Reverend, Ashlyn, Larissa, for really offering a wealth of information. If you're not looking at the chat, everyone agrees that this has been an incredible conversation. Thank you to Stephen and everyone at TriVersity. Thank you to Ed and everyone at Delaware Valley Action for helping put this together. I hopefully we all heard what we need to do here tonight, and hopefully we can have, around this issue at least, a different conversation about what happens now when the Equality Act has been passed. But until then, please, if you want to volunteer either with TriVersity or Delaware Valley Action, go to social medias, go to the emails. I did some DBA work and I'm on TriVersity. We need all the help that we can get in order to make this world a more livable place for anyone and everyone. Thank you all tonight for your questions, for your comments, and we hope to see you all very soon virtually, but please wear a mask so that we can see you in person a lot sooner. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, Ed.
Who was that? Steve.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. It was a great panel.
Good night, everybody. I unmuted. What a terrific panel. Thank you all. Terrific, really.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, Jack.
Yeah,
Good
it
night.
was fantastic, fantastic, fantastic.
Thanks for the very good.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Right. People sign off and then.
I'm just copying all the comments in the chat just to make sure that we have them for sure.
Oh, smart. I copied the links and then I will send that out. Ed, when you can get that recording to me, if I guess we'll have to share.
Let me stop the recordings.